Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be trying to do a very quick monthly wrap up, and the goal is to see how my opinions of the weekly read stuff has changed, if at all, and when it is hitting a book review where I single it out and do a separate thing, I'm just going to say my very quick thoughts and move on, because this month is at least 68 or 69 books, depending on if I count the very last book I read today as last month or this month. So let's see. First of all, I started with 3 Dreams in the Key of G by Marc Nash. This book was incredible. I gave it 5 stars and I have a video on it out already, so check it out. Next, I read Network Effect by the Murderbot Diaries, Martha Wells. This is a good series. If you're on the 5th book already, you're probably invested just like I am. I gave it 4 stars. I liked it quite a bit, and that hasn't changed since the weekly reads. I still am quite fond of it, and am grateful to Rosie Cockshut for mentioning that the novella Fugitive Telemetry takes place before this one, the 5th novel. So if you read it out of order, it's actually better, if you want a linear path anyway. Next, I read The Octopus Has 3 Hearts, short stories by Rachel Rose. This has its own video coming. It's not going to be for a little bit. It's down the pecking order because I gave it 1 star. I didn't like it at all. It centers people I didn't quite care about in a way that I didn't care about. Next, I read Filthy Animals by Brendan Taylor. I gave this 4 stars. I still find it 4 stars. I like it quite a bit. His voice overall is just great, and him centering the people that he does in the way that he does, especially this one, with the physicality of the one protagonist in particular that I quite like. The person who does ballet, I believe, or some sort of dance, was fantastic, but all the other stories are a little bit incongruent, and I kept wanting it to get back to that story. Next, I read The Heart Principle, The Kiss Quotient, gave it 5 stars. This is by Helen Hoang. This was fantastic. It's the first sort of superlative book in that series, I think, and it is a romance that feels very organic. They're both struggling with very specific hardships, and a romance blooms out of that in a way that isn't pure, just like our sexual chemistry is great. And also the sexual chemistry stuff with them has its own twists with it. And I just found both protagonists the most likable out of the trilogy. Next is 29 Seconds, TM Logan. Gave this 2 stars, didn't like it. Poorly executed commercial fiction thriller in which the protagonist is completely undermined all of the time and then has a Deus Ex Machina event at the end to bring it all together. Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. This is 4 stars. I still am very fond of this, and I still want to get a physical copy and consume it. The audiobook is fantastic. He has crafted a very unique voice for this that worked quite well. I don't know if I would have clicked with it first on paper, but now that it's in my head, when I go to the physical one and have that, I don't know, liminal space, I bet it would augment the experience quite well. Next, A Dream of a Woman by Casey Plett. I gave this 5 stars. A trans woman writes trans women narratives very well, it turns out. Who would have known? These are just people who are existing in Canada. There's a through line throughout the story collection that is fantastic, which is, you know, like Egg to Realized Woman. And then throughout it, there are just these sporadic ones that I think are in the bibliography of Casey Plett in other short story collections or publications. And so you get a wide breadth of experience, a wide breadth of different things occurring and different tension and conflict. There isn't the stereotypical stuff that you would see trans narratives have, at least in my opinion, as a cis white person who doesn't have trans experience. As much as I can say that this is done well, I think it has been, and I definitely recommend it. If you read it, definitely tag me or tell me in the comments what you thought of it, because I definitely want more perspectives on the book. especially if I have a blind spot or if you just want to gush about it. Next, Taste My Life Through Food, Stanley Tucci. 4 stars. You have to be invested in Stanley Tucci to really be into this book, I think, which I think he's a very endearing, heartwarming type of person. He writes a memoir exactly as you expect, and to make a through line and a notion of you wanting to return to the collection in the future, he puts recipes as well, which I think is very clever. Next, I read the Katharina Vermette Pemmican Wars. Gave this 3 stars. This is the first out of 4, and all of these volumes are 47 pages or so don't have too much that they can establish, and this is all set up. So it only goes uphill from here. The Storyteller, Tales of Life and Music by David Grohl. I tried this on audio, gave it 1 star, bailed on it. It was very, again, with these celebrity memoirs, I think you have to be invested in the celebrity in order to want and like it. And I was not. I didn't know who he was, what he had done, why I should care, etc. The writing didn't put me onto it, and neither did his narration, which was good, but I still didn't care. Next, The Phone Booth, or The Phone Box at the Edge of the World by Laura Messina. I gave this 3 stars. It was fine. Very midnight library, intersections of self-help through fiction with very prescriptive advice to people, hidden, kind of nestled into the dialogue or the events occurring and stuff like that. It's definitely not my favorite, but it barely passes muster basically for me. Next, I read The Trees by Percival Everett. 5 stars, maybe gonna be in my top 10 books of the year. Fantastic, have a video out on already, check it out. Fugitive Telemetry, also gave this 4 stars. Again, read this one before the 5th book and you'll probably have an even better experience because you don't have to recall or retcon what happened in that book to kind of get it. Murderbot doing murder police, essentially. Quite fun, quite good. I don't believe it is as grounded in social issues as other ones, but it was still enough to capture the 4 stars because it had the detective sort of narrative, which I'm always down for. This Place, 150 Years Retold by Kateri Dam, which is a collection retelling the 150 years of Canada from an Indigenous perspective. It's fantastic. It is very eclectic in terms of who is writing the piece, who is illustrating the piece, who is editing it, etc. There's a timeline for each little story that it encapsulates that is very helpful. And then the stories sort of vary, but I thought it was overall still fantastic. 5 stars, should be in every classroom. Next, The Age of Precarity, Endless Crisis as an Art and Government by Dario Gentili. This was 3 stars, barely passed muster, again because I was sort of blindsided by the change in what that title implies. I thought it was literally going to be about governments keeping us in a place of crisis. Instead, it is looking at the genealogy of the term crisis as it relates to our current language and lexicon, which was kind of interesting, but not what I signed up for. Next, I read Investigative Aesthetics, Conflicts and Commons in the Politics of Truth by Matthew Fuller. 4 stars. This was quite excellent, but very heavily coached in academic terms, which makes it strange because it's trying to sort of appeal to the commons, obviously, of people. Still very fond of this, still excellent. I have a video on it. The Book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki, gave this 5 stars, absolutely loved it. Postmodernist, weird take on mental health, who has agency in people's lives when they are not conforming to societal norms. There's a video out on this already. Embers, One Ojibwe's Meditations by Richard WAGAMESE. This was fine. It's obviously self-help, obviously spiritual. It is different than most self-help. It's more obviously centered on indigeneity. I like that quite a bit about it, but it still was a little bit formulaic. I still liked it quite a bit, and it succeeds in what it does, so it got 3 stars. The Spoils of War, Power, Profit, and the American War Machine by Andrew Cockburn. 4 stars. This is very eclectic. It retreads a lot of ground I'm already aware of in terms of America invading Afghanistan and where that conflict takes place, where it escalated from, what the CIA enrollment in it was, and all that kind of stuff. These are a collection of essays as well, so you can feel it not quite congruent all of the time, but it's still, if you especially don't know anything about the military-industrial complex, this is a fantastic start. It is very readable in a way the other Verso stuff coached in academia is not. Sweet Bitter, Stephanie Dandler, 3 stars. This set out what it intended to do, which is a coming-of-age story, intersectional, with like 18, 19-year-old moves to New York, except in this she's white and very privileged and kind of annoying. And she goes and gets a job at a predominant restaurant right away. And it's just her sort of trying to figure out her life, learning about food, wine, beverages, these sort of like microcosm or of this weird like night scene that all these people engage in, making it kind of like seedy and different and slightly marginalized. It's just interesting. I like it. The show is better though. If I Go Missing by Brianna Jonie, 5 stars, fantastic. This is a short little graphic novel that will take you like 15-20 minutes to consume. It is based on a actual letter that somebody in Winnipeg, an Indigenous girl of 16, I think, sent to her PM, and it takes excerpts from that and then places graphics with it, and then at the end it has the fully recreated letter, and it's essentially just about how white people don't care about Indigenous people going missing and dying, and her pleading with the PM to actually give a shit, basically. It's moving, heartfelt, fantastic, exactly what it sets out to do, 5 stars. The Case of the Missing Men, Hobtown Mysteries, Stories #1, Chris Burton. This was a 2-star read. I didn't like it because the actual mechanism of it revealing what has happened slowly goes into this very strange, fantastical landscape that is very strange. It's set in Canada, and it's sort of, you know, small kids on bikes without bikes solving mysteries. And there's some weird racism elements that come up into it. That was a little weird. Wasn't too big a fan of the actual line work in its black and white comic. It was fine, but then the elements that I didn't like bunched it down enough for me to have a negative opinion on it overall. Housemaid of Dawn by N. Scott Momaday, 4 stars. This was great. This is one of those narratives, kind of like I talked about Astra recently, where the main character isn't centered and all the people around him are getting perspectives on him, so he doesn't have agency in his actual story, which communicate things about Indigenous people, which the story is about. It's sort of arranged in a short story collection, very moving, Hemingway prose done correctly, so it's one of those times that I don't use Hemingway-esque as a pejorative, and I just thought it was great. Sunshine Girl, An Unexpected Life, Juliana Margulies' celebrity memoir type thing. Again, 2 stars, didn't like it. I do like her as a person and as an actor, so I wanted to give this a shot, but it's very like archetypical, basically. She charts her life in terms of going back to a mother-father relationships that's very toxic, and her recreating that dynamic in her life and sort of what that has done to her and how it's sort of spurred her to try harder and to succeed at these things but yet be distanced by people at an emotional level. Land, Water, Sky by Katlia. This is 4 stars. It's by a Dene woman. It charts a mythological approach to indigeneity, starting before colonialism, going after it. Short stories that go linearly jumping in time, exploring what happens to a sort of evil shapeshifter type person who is trying to get something from the people of the land, and how that sort of affects the surroundings, and uses it as a social commentary as it likens itself to white people and the evils of colonialism and whatnot. I thought it was great. Very contemporary in prose, clipped, sometimes sterile, not very active, and serviceable, but the content was such that if the prose were a little bit elevated, I think it would have been a 5-star read. Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood, I DNF'd this book. This is a Jane Eyre retelling, I think, subbed in Ethiopia. And it was not interesting to me because the narration was bad and I didn't like the voice. And so everything became kind of grating and boring. So I set it aside despite the premise sounding interesting. Next, I read a Haida manga by Michael Nicole Yagelnas. 4 stars, amazing concept. I talk about this in the weekly reads and that hasn't changed. Very interesting concept, very well executed, I think. The artwork is incredible. You don't get the full picture unless you actually rip the pages out of the book and arrange it into a mosaic, which takes 2 copies of the book, I think. So I gave it 4 stars because it's just not accessible to do that, like buy 2 copies and then have a space where you can do that. And it's an interesting concept, but very hard to execute for a normal person. Next, I read After Parties by Anthony So. This is 4 stars, stories that are interconnected and vary in length. All of them were quite good. They all showed this sort of like intergenerational trauma, I believe, who are displaced, and how that affects their personal relationships, how they navigate their world. And it's very good at showing sort of the subtleties in which people have to negotiate their world after going through something like that, even if it is not their personal lived experience and it comes from their parents or something like that, which is kind of a theme in this year's marginalized works coming out, as far as I can tell, at least in North America, which is great. Moonshot, Indigenous Comics, Volume 3, gave this 3 stars. The third one was great, but it is centered on a futuristic, almost cyberpunk in some parts kind of way, and none of the stories had the exact kind of excellent writing and punch, and more about speculative works that didn't quite come together that the second collection had, which was 5 stars and incredible. The first volume also was 3 stars and also sort of muddied as the same volume 3 one. So if you're going to pick up any of them, I highly recommend 2. Next, I read Kugali, Anthony Volume 1, Anthology Volume 1, Reiki Edition 18+ by Jasonas Lamy, who's the editor, I believe, who put all of these together. There's 3 different comics. One of them was absolutely fantastic and worth buying the comic for, and the other 2 were kind of forgettable. The artwork in that one was fantastic. It's Afrofuturism, and the artwork was just really stand out. It was anti-colonial, but still kind of like bombastic and fun. Next, I read Full Metal Indigiqueer Poems by Joshua Whitehead. Gave this 4 stars, thought it was absolutely fantastic. The concept alone is so intersectional that it's very hard to speak about, but it's also not completely congruent because it posits that Whitehead is sort of like running a program in his head, and this is where the cyberpunk part comes in, where he has a birthing sequence that parallels Ghost in the Shell, and then runs programs speaking on very specific subjects and then decolonizes them from the program's sort of point of view. So he'll talk about Shakespeare or Emerson or Seinfeld, even, like a whole bunch of range of different topics and how it made him feel, what he thinks about them. And then later on, interspersed are just some other things about his identity and are pertinent, but don't have the same conceit, and so felt a little bit strange. But it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. It is very poetic. It ranges in its deployment of poetry and its poetics. So it's, again, a very hard thing to codify
which I think is kind of the point of it. And it's, you know, autofiction, memoir, cyberpunk. It's a lot of different things, highly unconventional, and sometimes even has artworks. And it just explains a lot about his identity in a very fantastic way, especially if you have read Johnny Appleseed, his Giller Prize nominated book. I already talked about Moonshot Volume 1 and 2, so I guess I somehow have categorized this as 3, then 2, then 1, so I think Goodreads is just being strange. But again, the first one was fine. I view all of these comics as trying to get you to look at indigenous voices and illustrators and then follow those creators later. So it's sort of like a smorgasbord that you can choose from and then hopefully keep on buying their works and supporting them and at least knowing about these highly skilled creators out there, because there's not a lot of spotlight on these people. I read We Jane by Amy Wall, 4 stars. This was really great. The voice is very well crafted. It's about the collective of the Jane Collective, where it's about abortion rights in Canada, but has this sort of same sense of almost nopaming, where there's a collective of the marginalized female out there that people can draw from and like draw strength when they can work together, and how society and men work to like put that the brakes on that and come between those connections and pit them against each other and stuff. And then the actual narrative is about a woman who, like the actual plot, I should say, is about a woman who returns home to a Newfoundland town where everybody's in each other's business and everybody's talking about each other's business. She gets embroiled with a boy that she has been in a relationship previously, and it's all about her sort of trying not to fall into similar patterns. And then we have this overhead stuff about Wee Jane as well. So I thought it was very fantastic. On a reread, I suspect it might even be 5 stars. But in the initial reading, I was sort of just trying to figure stuff out, and I was completely lost in the voice that I thought was fantastic, and sort of was just happy to be there. Next, I read You Are Eating an Orange, You Are Naked by Sean King. This is 3 stars. I thought this was fine, but it didn't resonate with me completely. There is a lot of shorthand work in this that I don't like, in which it will reference something in pulp culture in order to not have to do the work in the fiction, which I think people would say is millennial or something, but it's also a constraint of the actual structure of the novella, I think. And sometimes it actually works quite well, because the subject of it is his relationship to these actual pulp culture touchstones, and how it sort of inflicts harm on him sometimes, or just his different perspective. But it's plot-wise ostensibly about him being in love with this woman who doesn't really negotiate the relationship in the same way as him. She's sort of doing her own thing and expects him to behave in a similar way, and he's sort of performing a role that he doesn't want to, because he's completely in love with her, basically. Next, I read Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. 3 stars. I thought this was fine. The fantastical elements were a little bit strange and didn't really do much for me. It didn't connect me to the characters all that much. It was well written, though. 9 Perfect Strangers, LIANE Moriarty. 2 stars. Didn't like it. Weird concept. Problematic in some ways. Definitely stand behind the 2 stars. I wouldn't recommend this. I liked Apples Never Fall quite a lot, but it has very specific sort of catnip qualities to me, and I made a video on that already, so I won't go into it. But read Apples Never Fall or Big Little Lies is sort of what I am hearing about other people, and this is not her best work. Tilly and the Crazy Eights by Monique Gray Smith. 3 stars. This is YA and children's to the point of sort of annoyance for me. It also is sort of Midnight Library-ish, where it's like self-help through fiction. It's about a group of elders being taken to the biggest powwow in North America, which is in Arizona or Arkansas, one of those. and they keep coming up against each other in surprising ways, where every interaction is a after-school special moment, and so it keeps swinging between like high drama and like high non-toxic masculinity, like the opposite of that, where they're bonding and connecting, and it just has no chill, basically. Going postal, Terry Pratchett gave this 4 stars, still stand behind that. It definitely exceeded my expectations. The pleasure of it came at a societal level, where I was very interested in the way that the main protagonist, who is a grifter, thief type person, is selected to run the post office, and he ends up succeeding because he like cons the system, which is just, you know, fantastic to me. I think it takes a grifter to instill change in a system that is broken, etc. And there was some surprisingly funny moments. I think most of it slid off my back in a harmless manner instead of me rolling my eyes, which was not to its detriment. I'll be reading Hogfather this month with that same read-along group. Dopamine, The Cure for White Ladies, Leanne Simpson is incredible. 5-star read. I am doing a buddy read with this, with Sina from Beating Around the Books, so I won't go into it, but 5 stars, unconventional, not concerned with Western lens, not concerned with Western values, including price point or value propositions for the actual book, which I think is clever, but will definitely piss people off. And unconventional premise, no like specific concern for traditional arcs in Western literature. Completely great. Next, I read the Katharina Vermette Red River Resistance, which is the 2nd volume in a girl called Echo, which I talked about just previously. This was 4 stars, exceeded my expectations, built off of the first one. Lots of great stuff. Flight of the Hummingbird, A Parable for the Environment. Michael Nikolyagonos, I guess must be the editor of this because he's the primary listing in this, but he is the person who illustrated it. And you might have seen that I mentioned him previously for the manga, and he was also in the Moonshot stuff. So Moonshot is doing the work where I found a whole bunch of different illustrators and writers that I quite liked, and then saw what they did, got it from the library. So that's good. Hummingbird, I gave 4 stars. It is a small parable with the Dalai Lama and some sort of meditations on the parable at the end. It's very quick. The artwork is stunning. Worth your time, especially since it's like 15-20 minutes. The Anthropocene Unconscious Climate Catastrophe in Contemporary Culture by Mike Bould, or Bould, one of those. 4 stars. This was pretty great. It investigates culture, looking for a subconscious feeling of sort of dread about climate fiction. It goes into literary fiction, contemporary fiction, B movies, A movies, like Fast and Furious and stuff like that, and weaves together a pretty compelling narrative that even when people are not specifically talking about climate change, we can't not talk about climate change because it's permeating culture that much. And it's not just the young generations that are concerned with it. Everybody has been talking about it for a very long time, whether they think they have or not. Next is August into Winter by Guy Vanderhaeg. And this is 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It's war military fiction that jumps in time with the 2 dual narratives. There's the time in the Great War, I believe it is, World War I, and then it jumps forward showing some of those characters, how they were affected by the war, and it has a pretty good romance, I think. Sometimes it's a little bit strange, but under the historical lens, maybe it is okay, but either way, I wasn't too invested in this, and the prose is what kept me going. It was exceptionally written, and even though I hate or detest war military fiction typically, and romance isn't my favorite, I made it through and it still met my expectations. It is either the winner or a long-listed book for the Writers' Trust in Canada. Next, I read Assembly by Natasha Brown. 2 stars, didn't like this. saw what it was doing from the macro level, why it was constructed the way it was, what it was communicating about her existence, her being tired of the microaggressions, the racism, the misogyny that she is being inflicted upon all of the time. But because every interaction and change in the chapter was one of those things, it became formulaic, and I didn't like the voice whatsoever, so it was hard to get through. I then read Carpe Fin, a Haida manga by Michael Yagonas again. This is 4 stars. This is the prequel to the Haida manga, which I thought was quite good. This doesn't require you to rip up the book, and it tells a very particular story about a character that you meet in Red. Again, the paneling is great. It's not as complex as Red, but it is making up for it in a very clean structure, very fun, mythological, not Western-centric, indigenous perspective, and it's just nice looking at this guy's art. It's fantastic. Next is Will I See by David Alexander Robertson. 4 stars. This is a comic book in which an indigenous girl starts finding all these strange objects with the help of a cat that she finds on the streets. It ends up being a story about indigenous women being taken off of the streets and or maybe killed, and her sort of protecting herself and educating the reader about these issues in Canada, and her trying to reclaim some agency. Thought it was great. 4 stars. Half-Breed by Maria Campbell, author, narrator. This is 4 stars. I thought it was good. I liked it, and I think it would have been a 5-star read if it wasn't her narrating the book, which is funny because Sean the Book Maniac just did a review and said that he loved the audiobook. So maybe give it a shot, see if it's for you, 50-50. I thought it was very like monotonous and plodding when she was dictating it, and I don't know, it just felt very like robotic, and I don't need it for it to have like a big sense of feeling, especially when they're narrating horrific events and things that they live through. But it also needs to not just be like monosyllabic reading. That becomes very annoying, and I prefer to read the physical copy of it. So I probably will get that from the library at some point. Otherwise, her life was wild. She went through so many things that would completely just break the normal person, came through it, and is helping other people. It's a fantastic story and very pertinent even now. Next is Will by Will Smith. 2 stars. This book sucked, and it's very muddied in what he was trying to get across, because initially it starts with him divulging all of these different things about his childhood, his trauma, and all this different stuff, and it becomes very almost like a formula where he's trying to endear you to him so that when he drops things that are very problematic, you're like, oh, but it's the trauma, and not paying attention to the fact that, you know, up until 30 or 40 or 50 years old, he hasn't been doing the work to unpack his trauma despite massive privilege. And there is some very disturbing reveals with him, such as like his first sort of predominant ex, he was very controlling over, extremely creepy, toxic masculinity, and when she left to go to a party, he assumed that she was cheating on him because she had cheated on him one time before, and based on the relationship that they discuss, I can see why they had problems. But when she returns, he takes every single item he's ever bought her and lights it on fire with lighter fluid in front of her. Things like that. He then launches into his career, his sort of aspirations, how he obtained them, and all of that kind of stuff, and it completely shifts away from the sort of memoir angle and becomes just like, me on the come up, this is how I did it, this is my thinking. And there is a few moments of introspection here and there, but most of the time it is very, very, very vapid. Next, I tried to read Home Waltz by G.A. Grisomwaite, and this is a book that I gave no stars, DNF'd. It had some things about it that I just wasn't wanting to consume despite the prose being very good. It's about a young kid, 13, 14 years old, in the 70s in a small town where it's like mixed, and I think a lot of indigenous people live there. and their stakes for the story was they want to get to a party and kind of like get wailed and blitzed, and I just didn't really care. And then it also had very toxic dynamics between the three friends that are indigenous, how they bullied each other, how they didn't treat each other with respect, and then also on top of that, the town being very racist towards them. And I have personal experience living in a location like that, and just found that I didn't want to be in that space. The Book of Magic, Practical Magic #2, Alice Hoffman, gave this 4 stars. Liked it quite a bit. I talk about it at length in the last weekly reads, so I would point you there, but I thought it was a fitting conclusion to the trilogy. I reflect on some of the ways that the magic and the world building are done. She has a really great mix of hard and soft world building. The magic system is pretty cool, I think, and is like intuitive. It has roots in culture, in previous fictional works that might be predominant in the cultural intellect. She does surprisingly deep stuff, and it's like intersection of coming of age, of sort of supernatural forces battling each other, and then like mundanity and the sort of like malaise and sadness of life coupled with their curse that is predominant throughout their family line. And this is the book that addresses the curse directly. The Jasmine Throne, Burning Kingdoms by Tasha Suri. This is 3 stars. I thought it was completely fine. I was forgetting it even as I was reading it type deal. It was young adult that was very bland to me, even though the world building was quite different and it wasn't Western centric. It has a queer romance that was great though. I liked seeing that emerge, and otherwise just wasn't compelled because the voice for me wasn't there. Then I read Diana, The Unseen Ones short stories by Norma Dunning. I have a video on this coming. 4 stars, thought it was great. This is a Writers' Trust Award winner or finalist. I'm pretty sure it won though. And I thought it was great. It centers Inuk people in Canada, and similarly to Nopaming centers a different person with a different short story. Says some very specific things, allows people to just live their lives while being marginalized and sort of facing conflicts that most people don't have to deal with, and sort of the toll that it takes on them. Next, I read Northwest Passage by Katharina Vermette. 4 stars. This is similarly a girl named Echo, the 3rd volume of that. I thought it built on that quite well again, and the 4th book is forthcoming from my library, so I'll tie a bow on that. And it is predominantly about the Louis Riel Métis past in Canada, and how they were violently displaced, and how the resistance occurred, what happened with the resistance, what happened to Louis Riel if you don't know, etc. Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe. Benjamin Sainz. I gave this 3 stars. I thought this was just fine because it's highly melodramatic. The boys were pretty good, but their actual sort of dynamic was always a little bit there to simply feed into drama until of the coup at the end, essentially, to me. To a degree, I think this is just because it's YA and it's how it's structured, how it's written. The dialogue didn't seem very believable to me though, and it feels sometimes after school special, but it does land it, I think. Maggie Nelson Bluettes, 3 stars. This was just fine for me. I think it meanders, and some things are more interesting than others. It's her meditations on her obsession with the color blue, but then digresses into different other things like love life and one other thing, I think. But it was fairly forgettable to me, but a unique concept that was executed fine. Jordan Abel's Nishka is a 5-star read. Have a video coming on this, but it's completely fantastic. And within academia discovers that he has a very complicated past with his indigeneity. It goes into the trauma inflicted on his parents and his grandparents about residential schools. And then he was taken away from his parents at a young age. And so he is focusing this book on finding out his indigeneity and his heritage and his relationship to it by using mixed media, by using transcripts of actual lectures that he's given. He's pretty well known in Canada. His father is a predominant artist in Canada, but he uses that artwork interposed with text that is sometimes colonial, sometimes his own work, and then uses found objects as well. And so it's sort of like a moving art piece that you consume as you read the book, and it's completely unconventional, very fantastic, moving, one of the best books of the year that I've read. Next is The Plotters by Unsoo Kim. 3 stars. This was just fine for me. It is about a hitman, but rooted in verisimilitude in very strange ways. It's endearing in its own way. It's a little bit dark, a little bit gritty, but also sort of light when he has to interact with people outside of his micro world, basically. But it is good. It lands the, punch. I gave it 3 stars. It is what it is on the tin, I think. Next is The Tragedy of the Worker Towards the Proletariat by the Salvage Collective. This is 3 stars. It's essentially their manifesto, and in that it succeeds, but it's coached in academic language. It's not actually for the worker, so another tragedy again, chalk it up. And it retraces a lot of stuff that you should probably already know, but if you don't, would be very helpful in its criticisms of actual capitalism and why it needs to be a salvage operation at this point. Next is Felix Ever After by Kaysen Callender. I gave this 4 stars. The premise is terrible, basically. Felix is outed, against their will obviously, and decides to catfish a specific person that he is suspicious of, basically, while they kind of have a weird detective thing going on throughout it, but it's definitely like, it is the A plot, but it's mostly the B plot. And it's intersectional. It explores transness, misogyny, a lot of different ways that the LGBTQ plus community harms each other because some aspects don't acknowledge their privilege, for instance. I thought it was very moving, very well done. Contemporary prose, nothing standout there, but it really does land what it's trying to do, and then some, especially with a premise that is like, this could be very problematic, but it isn't. At least when it is problematic, it is doing that on purpose to point to specific issues about things, which was a nice surprise. I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. This was a 5-star read for me. It's a very short 96-page memoir that I listened to on audiobook. She narrates it herself. I thought it was fantastic. And it is not just about hating men or being afraid of men. She talks about how her philosophy, I guess, about performing gender is changing and evolving, and how the pedestal of sort of hypermasculinity or even the softness of some men, especially if they're queer, puts them on a pedestal that they can't live up to and can sabotage certain aspects of the relationship. So it's just a lot of very personal thoughts that will either probably resonate with you or not, and they did for me. Then I read The Years by Annie Arnaud. I gave this 5 stars. There's a video coming out on this. This is a memoir, autofiction thing. It's hard to codify what it is in terms of genre because it's her compiling a whole bunch of notes and then sort of remembering the cultural moment at that time and then codifying that into poetic prose, basically. It skips into we and me sometimes, so it'll be like what is happening in that cultural moment and then specifically where she was, if she can remember. And it traces her life from 47 to 2006, I believe. Fantastic. I love the voice. It'll be make or break for this one if you like the voice or not, though, like more so than others, because it is very unusual and the subject changes quite a bit and is put under a different lens all of the time. So I think people who are wanting their lens and point of view to conform to a specific thing will hate this book. A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. I give this 3 stars, rounded up from 2.5. Weakest part of this series so far. May or may not proceed with the next book. Didn't land the ending. Again, it's like a 700-page book. Why, God, why? And was this more or less just fine. It drummed up a whole bunch of drama last time with her sisters, and it jumped the shark is basically what it did. Never Saw Me Coming by VERA KURIAN. I gave this 1 star. I gave it 25%. Sucked. Didn't like it at all. Commercial fiction voice. So boring. And I just couldn't continue despite it being about a college where a bunch of different people who are neurodivergent and can't feel empathy in various different ways go to a campus for a social experiment, and someone ends up dying, and she ends up being implicated in it in some way, and so there's a mystery. You would think it would be very interesting. I'm very compelled to seek out these narratives about people like that. I like Hannibal, I like detective stories, I like mysteries, and yet it just couldn't keep me on in any way. And the narration was quite good even, so I don't know, I think it just wasn't good. Next is Midnight's Children, a novel by Salman Rushdie. Probably know what this is. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was very interesting. I don't think it hit everything that it was trying to do, and sometimes becomes very meandering. But it is so worth the read. Very cool to see what he does with fantastical elements. He is born on midnight, and all of the children of midnight have a different power, and he is like both trying to seek out these people to form like a coalition. He is paralleling himself to the growth of India as a country, which was born on his date of birth, and just really satirizing certain aspects of the country while being very biting and even sometimes nihilistic about certain outcomes, but it vacillates between that and outright hopefulness and idealism. So it's a very hard book to completely pin down for me, but I definitely think it's worth reading. I definitely think it'll exceed your expectations no matter what anyone has told you about this book, because there's so much going on and to cling to, and the voice is just exceptional. Although I have seen reviews where people said that the voice was too like self-involved, important, and narcissistic, and so they didn't like it. I felt like he gives a lot of voice to other people even through that, and he even acknowledges that point and sort of addresses it within the fiction if you get to that point. Next is This Accident of Being Lost, Songs and Stories by LIANE Simpson. This was 3 stars. It's a short little sort of memoir, but it focuses on her like love life and her relation to people who have grown up in Western society and how they tend to treat women and how she tends to treat herself based on her indigeneity and intersections. And some of it is outright toxic, some of them is very endearing, and I thought it was compelling and does what it sets out to do, but I just wasn't that interested in the subject matter of it. So if you like her as a person, if you're interested in her being vulnerable in that specific way, I think it could easily be a 4 or 5 star read, but for me it was just fine. Next, there are the HONJIN Murders by WAGAMESE. I hope that's correct. 2 stars, didn't like it. This is a classic that was recently translated, so I don't know if my issues will be specific to the translation or not, because I haven't read enough translation to know what bad translation looks like. But what I'll say about it is the actual setup of the mystery and its mechanisms and its deployment is very fun. The character of the detective is also quite fun. He's a Sherlock person, but younger, disheveled. I think he also has that sort of typical either addicted to drugs or alcohol thing. And he sort of likes having his showman stuff happening as well. So I think there's a lot of analogous things happening between him and Sherlock, obviously. But it is about a family who has a wedding, and on the wedding night, the couple is found dead, and nobody is in the room. It's a locked room mystery. The shutters are closed, etc. It also is snowing, so there's no footprints. It's very baffling. And then there's a normal inspector who comes on the scene for like half of the book, and he's trying to figure it out. And then the main character, detective dude, shows up, and he solves it pretty readily enough, basically. It has a very different perspective in that the first chapters is actually the author himself talking about how he heard about the case and surveying the land as it is now in a dilapidated kind of form. And then also weaves in and out these perspectives of different people he's interviewed in a bid to kind of show that it is not just fiction. He's spoken to people and then summarizes what they've said to him, which is kind of like Borges-esque, which I like. But overall, the thing that didn't go for me is the actual writing itself is quite bad at times. It's Hemingway-esque, poorly done, in the sense that it tries to be short and clipped, but isn't. It has a lot of weasel words. It has a lot of very strange adjectives and verbs, which makes me think it might be the translation. But also, the strange thing about it is that when it is describing things, it will also reiterate stuff in a strange way. So when there's a killing, it'll say the sound of the koto is going, and it's makes the actual onomatopoeia sounds in the thing, but then also talks about the sound of the string. So it's like doubling up on the description. When a sliding door falls, it literally is like, the sentence is almost verbatim. I am paraphrasing because I can't remember exactly. There was a thump, which is in italics, no comma, like a sliding door had fallen. And it is a sliding door. So it's not like a sliding door has fallen. A sliding door literally fell, so use the as there, right? And this happens all of the time throughout it. It drove me nuts, basically. And so it's very strange because it's always for sounds that the reader would know as well as the characters, yet they're not identified, but then double identified because the description has it as if they don't know, but they do know. So I don't know, it's very annoying. Then the actual method is interesting, but completely contrived, and within the time frame that they have, I think may be impossible. So keep it in your heart as like, this is a fun romp. It's one of those Sherlock stories where you have to just turn off your brain and go with it, and then maybe you'll like it. I have the next book that's translated, which is the 6th book, and I believe this book is his first work or close to it. So it does seem like it's sophomoric, and maybe the next book won't have these issues. I'm interested to see. And the final book is Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. I gave this 3 stars, historical fiction about 19th century China, where women were having their feet bound and had like no agency whatsoever. They were married off as property, didn't have a voice, couldn't use their voice, and it was all arranged marriages, whatnot. And she forms a very intense, I guess, friendship with Snowflower, and they have a very specific lady dialect thing where nobody else can kind of read their language, unless it's other women who've been taught this very specific thing. So it's like pen pals that get very close. Some people say it's like too sapphic, but I didn't get that. Like I think people are making it, they're conflating it as if Lisa C is insinuating these things about their relationship when they're actually the reader projecting these things onto the relationship. I thought it was very endearing, very sweet, complicated, and though it is not the A plot, it read like the A plot, because the A plot is so boring and so dry. The voice itself is not very compelling. If I hadn't been consuming it on audiobook, I would have put it down for sure. Most people like it. I tried another book of hers, the Hummingbird Lane one or something, and similarly I didn't like the voice, so I think she's just not an author that I really jibe with, and so I will not be reading any more of her stuff. And that's it. That's my whole month. If you read any of these books, I'd like to know what you thought. If you have any questions, hit me up. I know I tried to speak very rapidly about everything, so maybe you have a few questions about certain things. And I'm trying to put out videos as fast as I can, but there's so many books that I wanted to talk about that they're scheduled until like the end of the month and then some. So just be patient if something that you want me to speak specifically about isn't out yet, but mention it in the comments, because I'll do my order to put the stuff that people want to see first, of course. And other than that, I'll talk to you next video. Bye.